Well, hello. We're here today to talk about chapter Matthew 15 as we continue on in our journey through the book of Matthew. I hope you have the text before you so that you can follow along as we see where this is taking us. And Lee has looked at this chapter for us already and said he's seen the important theme of eating, so that'll be what we're talking about today. Maybe you'll grab a snack as we read through this too. But as we look at eating, is there anything you want our attention focused on as we go ahead through this chapter?
Yeah, well, that's just kind of a way to organize our looking at it. Food and eating are mentioned in the three main stories of chapter 15. It'll just be kind of a fun way to tie them together. But each story individually makes a very important point about Jesus' priorities for his disciples and his expectations for the kind of ministry they'll carry on into the world. And if those were Jesus' expectations for them, guess what? I think we need to take it seriously for ourselves as well. Now, the first one is a little tricky at the beginning of chapter 15 because this one involves knowing things about Jewish, not only the Jewish law that we can read in the Old Testament, but Jewish traditions. And there were a lot of traditions about clean and unclean. And I think many people know from the book of Leviticus that there's a lot of instructions about unclean foods, unclean animals and things like that you weren't supposed to eat. And that was something that Jews continued to take very seriously in Jesus' day. But they kind of expanded that notion of uncleanness and applied it and interpreted it in some ways that are frankly not at all in the Old Testament. They come out in the teachings and traditions of their rabbis. Rabbis were the great Jewish teachers of Jesus' day. And so Jesus never contradicts the law, but he does kind of say, well, let's take it easy on these traditions. We're not really sure these are the traditions of human beings. They may not be the will of God. And that's what's going on here.
Okay.
So the first one has to do with some scribes and Pharisees who come to Jesus complaining about the behavior of his disciples. Scribes, remember, are teachers of the law. They were experts. They began by copying the law, making written copies of the law. They did that so much that they memorized the law, and because they knew it better than anybody else, they became teachers.
Okay.
And Pharisees are the ones who tried to keep the law, Jews who tried to keep every law in the Old Testament, and that developed into a kind of legalism and pride that Jesus found very troubling. And even worse, legalism tends to go over into judgmentalism of other people.
Okay.
And Jesus scolds the Pharisees on both those counts. So they come and say, verse 2, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? There's that rabbi's teachings. They don't wash their hands before they eat. Now, I don't know. Were you taught to wash your hands before you
Yes,
eat?
yeah.
Okay.
But not as a matter of spirituality.
There you
that's
go.
the weird,
There you go.
They
Okay.
didn't teach us it in a Christian way in kindergarten,
That's right.
So.
Okay. Well, hygiene is okay. This had nothing to do with hygiene. This was purely ritualistic.
Okay.
In fact, in Jesus' day, I've read in the writings of the rabbis, which we still have from Jesus' day. One rabbi said to have your hands ritually clean before you eat, you have to use at least an eggshell amount of water.
Okay.
That much water. You pour it into the palm of your hand, and then you take the other fist and grind it into your palm. Then you take that amount of water and pour it into your other palm, grind your fist in, you're clean.
Okay.
So you can see it has nothing to do with hygiene, right?
Yeah, that doesn't seem very
So,
hygienic.
yeah, you could still have lots of dirt under your
Yeah.
fingernails, right? And your mother would send you away from
Yeah.
the table, go wash your hands really well this time. So this is all having to do with ritual uncleanness. And the connection, this is important in chapter 15, was mainly to contamination if Jews came into contact with Gentiles
Okay.
or with things that Gentiles had touched. That's the contamination
Wow.
they're really afraid of.
Huh.
So it has nothing to do with the health of the food or the cleanliness of their hands.
Unclean people.
That's
Wow, okay.
that's the tradition here. And Jesus says in verse 3, why do you break the commandment of God for the sake of your tradition? You're so focused on these meaningless rituals that you miss the point of many of the laws of God. And then Jesus gives an example in verse 4. He said, you know what God taught. It's right there in the Ten Commandments, right? Honor your father and your mother. And then later, the law says, whoever speaks ill of father and mother deserves to die. And then Jesus talks about a custom that the Pharisees had developed. It's in the phrase, given to God. In verse 5, whatever support you might have had from me is given to God. Then that person need not honor their father. And that phrase, given to God, is an Aramaic word that Jesus used, korban. And what it meant was, if a Pharisee had money that they kind of knew in the back of their mind they ought to use for the care of their parents, they could say, oh no, this needs to be given to God. And they donate it to the temple.
Okay.
Or to their own upkeep, because they're ministers,
their own
right?
Salary in a sense. Okay,
right,
okay.
like that. Although the Pharisees technically weren't salaried, but use it for their own resources, because here they are, spiritual teachers. Jesus says, you guys are hypocritical about this. You're actually breaking one of the Ten Commandments while you're keeping one of the traditions of the rabbis. And so he really scolds them on that, and once again calls them hypocrites in verse 7. Here's another place where prophecy kicks in, right?
Yes, we see that it's a quote from Isaiah 29, where it says, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you. And it's when he said, and it goes on, this is kind of a harsh insult, I think, that this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. To hear that as a Pharisee and a scribe, that doesn't seem like a good thing to hear.
Yep. So this passage begins with a very stern scolding of the Pharisees and scribes for their kind of preference for the traditional teachings of the rabbis over the actual revealed law of God. In verse 10, then, he turns away from scolding them directly and talks to the crowd that's always around him wanting to learn. And so he deals with this whole business of unclean foods in verse 11 when he says, it's not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, that, in other words, food. Products. It's what comes out of the mouth that defiles. Well, then the disciples, get in on the act. They come up and say, "Whoa, the disciples heard what you just said to the crowds, and they took offense." And Jesus calls them another name in verse 14. Not a very nice name. Blind guides.
Blind guides, yeah.
Oh, wow. Hypocrites and now blind guides. And Jesus goes on, and he doesn't back off at all. He clarifies his teaching in verse 17. Don't you see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and then, goes out of the body? Verse 18, but what comes out of the mouth comes out of your actual heart, out of your will, out of your mind. Out of the heart comes evil intentions, the temptation to murder or commit adultery or sexual immorality of all kinds, theft, false witness, slander. He's still lurking in the Ten Commandments here with many of these, isn't he?
Yeah, there's sinful actions that are in the law, whereas the hand washing wasn't. It was in tradition,
exactly,
but not
exactly.
in Leviticus.
Yeah. So he says, these things, violations of God's will for the way in which human beings are supposed to interact with one another, that is what defiles a person, not eating with unwashed hands or eating the wrong kind of food. So Jesus really is doing a very strong teaching here about the role of these traditions and these rabbinical teachings, and says that he's certainly not going to nullify the law, but he is going to nullify the legal role of these traditional teachings, and so he calls them to righteousness, not just rituals. Probably something we ought to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's a
as
hard
well.
thing. I think sometimes we can read this and think, oh, we would never do anything like that, because we don't think of ourselves as thinking about religious hand washing and stuff like that. So what are some ways that you see us applying this, or that we could apply this to our own traditions?
Oh, my goodness. There are a lot of little traditions that we have developed that we really hold fast to. I'm not sure that the most important ones will come to mind, but this one's kind of a silly one, but I think it illustrates it. When I was young, I was taught by my father to take my ball cap off whenever I went into a building. And I don't mean just church.
Just in any
I mean
building.
any
Okay,
building.
yeah.
My home, a public building, whatever. I remember one time he had to go and do some business at the county courthouse, and they took me along, and we walked in, and I was kind of looking around because I'd never been in a courthouse before. It was kind of a big deal, a lot of people bustling around, and for some reason I forgot to take my baseball cap off, and we were one step inside the door, and when he realized that I wasn't making the move, he reached behind my head and slapped the back of my head and sent my ball cap flying.
Whoa.
And looked at me, and of course, he didn't have to say a word. I knew.
You knew.
Yeah. And years later, I thought, he cared more about me wearing a ball cap in a building than about just about anything. At least that's the way I felt. And I realized, where does it say that you're not supposed to wear a ball cap in
a
someplace?
building, yeah.
Or even in church, but that tradition of that being disrespectful was so real that he enforced that law as hard as he would have enforced anything in my life.
Wow,
Anyway,
okay,
it's kind of a silly example, but it reminds us that we can really get quite exercised over traditions, and it's not that there's anything bad inherently about that, but it makes the other really important stuff that relates to righteousness kind of be less important, if we elevate every tradition to that level.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, well, I think it was more important to him that your ball cap wasn't on than that maybe it looked a little weird that your cat went flying across the...
Yeah, that he hit his son in the head.
Yeah, so, but it shows how easy it is, because I know that is something that's very important to some people, wearing a hat in church especially, or in any place. And because you're right, it's not that we're trying to criticize someone for having that mentality, but more to hold up, are we saying that's more important than something else that Jesus actually did say, to not lie or to commit any of these other sins against people, and that we want to make sure that we hold those to the same seriousness as some of our cultural things.
That's a great statement. And the best illustration of what you just said is actually a little later on in Matthew. I hope we're not stealing our own thunder here.
Hopefully they'll come back.
Yeah. But I do want to mention it here real quickly, because later on, it's in Matthew 23:23. Jesus says, one of the things that's bad about you Pharisees is that you tithe all the little stuff. And he says, you guys are such good tithers, giving 10%. If you get 10%, if you get a packet of mint that you're going to spice your food with, you tithe 10% of that mint. And he lists a bunch of other spices. He says, that's how legalistic you are. Now, Jesus, there's nothing evil about tithing mint, I suppose. But here's the next part that really is the key, and it's what you were just saying. He said, you do that, but you completely ignore justice for the poor. You completely ignore mercy for the wrongdoer or for the alien, the stranger. You ignore deep faithfulness in your life to God.
Yeah.
And that became the problem. By putting so much focus on the minutia and the traditions, human traditions, that we kind of devalue the things that God deeply cares about.
Wow, yeah, that's a good word for us. Yeah.
Okay.
Wow, I love that. So much packed into that story there.
So watch out for that hat.
Yeah, there we go.
When you're in the room with me.
I won't wear a hat next to you. Yeah, I'll wear one in the next video. So then we go ahead to another eating story, and it's eating with a Gentile woman. So we're in verses 21 through 28 here, and we see that, so he's in the district of Tyre and Sidon. Is that how you say it?
Yeah,
and that's a Gentile area to begin with.
Sure
and then
enough.
a Canaanite woman comes by. So this is a really interesting story that I think a lot of people have trouble understanding at times because it can feel a little weird. So tell us about this. Explain it a little bit for us.
Yeah, now to be honest, I'm the one who said we've got eating stories here. Jesus doesn't actually, we're not told that he ate with her.
But there's just more eating
maybe
coming
he
up,
did.
yeah.
But there is a reference to food.
yeah.
So it fits. And yes, I'm glad you mentioned Tyre and Sidon. Not only were they Gentile territory, they were in the area where Canaanites lived. And that's where Jezebel came from. Remember Jezebel in the Old Testament?
Yeah.
She was this pagan princess who came and married a Jewish king, Ahab, a prince, and who became the king. And she brought terrible paganism, Baal worship, and all kinds of terrible stuff into Judah. That's where this woman is from.
Wow.
I'm not saying she was like Jezebel, but she was like Jezebel.
It might bring up kind of some of those memories.
Yeah, ethnically, she really was.
Wow.
And now when Jesus is coming through that area, first of all, Jesus wasn't afraid to go and take his disciples into Gentile territory. That's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And when he does, she recognizes him. She identifies him. And what she calls him is truly surprising, isn't it?
Yes, she says, "Son of David," and that's a thing. I don't know how many people even recognized him that way. I don't know how much you would think a Gentile would care that he's the son of David. But I think we talked about this probably a lot in our first video, how that was such a powerful kingly title to talk about him that way. And here's a Canaanite woman saying, "You are the son of David." She's recognizing him as the Messiah.
Yeah. I think she's saying, I agree with you. I think she's saying more than, "Oh, you're a son of David. You're a Jewish man." I don't think there's something more going on here. Now, maybe she doesn't believe he's the Messiah, but she knows that many people believe that he is.
Okay.
That the disciples do. And she cries out in behalf of her daughter, tormented by a demon. Now, Jesus' response here is very surprising and in some ways potentially troubling. Because number one, verse 23, he did not respond to her.
Yeah.
Which seems very unlike the Jesus of compassion that we've been encountering. And when he didn't say a word, that kind of opened the door to the disciples to speaking up. And they counseled Jesus at near the end of verse 23 there, "Send her away." She keeps shouting. She's bothering us. She's calling unwanted attention to you.
Yeah.
Send her away. Now, that just echoes in my mind what the disciples did back at the feeding of the 5,000 that we
Once
talked
again,
about last week, right?
They're like, get rid of her. Yeah, we don't want to deal with this. Yeah, it seems like they're sending people away more than you would expect them to.
I know.
Yeah.
And instead of, how can we help, it's send them away. That's what they did with the hungry people. And now that's what they're doing with her. And then Jesus finally does speak up. And this is almost more troubling than his silence, potentially. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." It sounds like Jesus saying, well, I'm not going to send you away, but I'm certainly not going to help you because you're just not part of my mission. I was called to minister to Jews. And sorry, but you're not part of my agenda.
Yeah.
That's kind of like, what is it? And finally then, it's the woman who gets very proactive. In verse 25, came and knelt before him. She's already called him the Messiah, and now she kneels in almost worship before him and says, "Lord, help me." And for a third time, Jesus appears to push her away in verse 28. No, where am I?
Now I'm getting lost.
Verse 26. It's not fair. 26. It's not fair to take the children's food, that's Jews and throw it to the dogs. That's the term that Jews actually used to describe Gentiles.
Yeah,
They called them dogs.
an offensive term. Yeah,
It was
definitely.
an offensive term. And so first, Jesus wouldn't talk to her at all, wouldn't respond to her need. Second, he says, well, I have nothing against you, but my agenda is for the Jews. Here, he says, you know what? It's just not fair for me to use my divine authority to heal your daughter when you're a Gentile, and I need to save my reserves for Jewish needs. That's very troubling, is it?
Yeah,
Does
that
that
doesn't feel
sound
like
like
what
Jesus
you want Jesus
to
to
you?
be saying. Yeah, so I think that's why this passage, often you can read it and be like, okay, let me turn the page, and keep moving on. So
it's
yeah,
hard.
what have you seen for how do we explain that?
Yeah, well, I will tell you that very thoughtful Christian scholars have come up with two different ways of interpreting this. Some think that Jesus is saying, I appreciate your needs, but my time just has not come to minister to Gentiles. I got to keep my focus on Jews. And they go on to say that when she says in verse 27, even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the master's table, that she is actually seeing his messianic ministry more clearly than he is, and she's kind of schooling Jesus about how broad his ministry needs to be. So that's one interpretation. It's not just that I'm not comfortable with that picture of Jesus, but that isn't the picture of Jesus that I've gotten in reading the Gospel of Matthew so far. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so we've seen so many other ways that Jesus is broadening the kingdom of God. It seems weird that he'd say no to this woman in this way, especially.
Yeah. Remember healing the slave of the centurion, the Roman centurion?
Because of his faith, too.
Yeah. And he could have easily said to the Roman centurion, oh, well, I respect you, and I appreciate the dire needs of your slave, but I'm sorry, I've got to keep my focus on Jews for now. He didn't do that.
Yeah.
He just jumped right in and healed the guy. So it doesn't fit Jesus to me. So I take a different interpretation, which is that Jesus is testing. He's not being put to the test. He already knows he's here for everyone. He's putting his disciples and the woman to test. If he pushes back just a little bit here, is she going to run and say, okay, sorry, you're here for the Jews. That's right, you're the Jewish Messiah. I'm sorry, I don't deserve it. No, she pushes right back to his pushback and says, oh, come on, Jesus. I know you're here for the Jews mainly, but don't I even get some of the crumbs? And he just loves it. He says, oh my goodness, look at that faith. This is amazing faith. Your faith is great here. So maybe this was, I think, a test of her, and she passed the test, and Jesus responded. I think he's also testing the disciples, because they are the ones who seem to be having trouble catching on to the real breadth of his ministry. In the feeding of the 5,000, we saw that they seem to be having trouble catching on to the fact that Jesus didn't come just to teach and preach, just to heal sick people, but to meet other kinds of physical needs like hunger and homelessness and things like that. And so here, I think he's testing them to see if they have caught on to the breadth of his ministry, that the kingdom is for everybody, Jews as well as Gentiles as well as Jews.
And I love, too, I'm thinking a lot, last week we used that image of abundance and scarcity. And that she seems to have a better picture of the abundance of God's power and mercy and love than the disciples do. Once again, they're saying, send her away. And she's acknowledging that she could get some crumbs. And for her to think that the crumbs are enough, that just says something to me, that the crumbs of Jesus' grace and mercy and love are still so much more than we can imagine. That even from that he's able to do an act of healing. That's just a huge thing for us to recognize how powerful Jesus is.
I'd never thought of that. The crumbs that she refers to are kind of like the leftovers in the feeding of the 5,000 story, right?
Yeah.
There's always enough
There's
when
always
it comes
enough.
to Jesus. So this is a beautiful story in which an unclean woman is not only ministered to by Jesus, but commended by Jesus for her faith. And this, when Peter very recently was kind of chided for his little faith, here she steps up.
She's praised.
Again, I'm challenged by this story. It makes me wonder if I, as an individual Christian and as part of the Lord's church, don't fall into the trap of this send them away, send her away mentality. If we recognize a need, identify a need, it's so easy to, like the disciples, well, send them into the village. Surely they can find some food there. Or, Jesus could have said, don't you have, Gentile witch doctors or something,
Your own gods.
Yeah, go pray to Baal or something like that.
Yeah.
Don't bother me. Send them to somebody else. And it's so easy for me to think, well, I don't think the church is really mobilized to do that. Are we? There are government agencies that are for that, and there are other nonprofits that do that, and there are other charitable organizations. It's so easy to send them away to somebody else, and it looks like Jesus' attitude is, wait a minute, before you do that, count the cost, evaluate your resources, and think about ways in which you can apply those to this need.
Yeah. That's beautiful.
Okay.
Wow. And then finally we go on to verses 29 through 31. And these are just a good, quick story here that we see what happens after Jesus leaves from that place. I want you to hear these words. Great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the maimed, the mute, and many others. They put them at his feet, and he cured them, so that the crowd was amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And they praised the God of Israel. So what do you see in this beautiful
I agree.
section?
This is so beautiful. Yeah. It's just a summary. It's very repetitious.
Yes.
We already knew all of this information. But Matthew just has to pause and kind of sum up what Jesus has been doing. And I don't think we need to, I really have nothing to teach from those verses. I just have several exclamations to make. Number one, what a list. Number two, what compassion. Number three, what power and authority Jesus demonstrated. And number four, what a perfect response. They praise the God of Israel.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
That's what the ministry of Jesus accomplished.
We see the heart of his ministry there.
Yeah.
And then we finish out the chapter with a story in verse 32, where it's another feeding story. And this one's really interesting because we see that it sounds familiar, because last week in chapter 14, we read a story that sounds awfully similar. So what are some of the parallels we see, and what are some of the differences we see in these stories?
People have always wondered, and I wonder, why we have two such similar stories here. And the similarities are significant to the feeding of the 5,000. There was a crowd. Jesus had compassion on the crowd. They were hungry because they'd been listening to teach all day. They were in a deserted place, in other words, without towns and shops and stores and things like that. The disciples are pretty incapable of taking control of the situation. And so Jesus has to take the initiative. He does involve the disciples, though. That's interesting. He doesn't just do it all himself. But as with the previous feeding, he gets them involved. The eaters are filled to satisfaction, and there are leftovers. All of those are almost identical to the previous story.
Yeah.
But some students of these stories have noticed some pretty interesting differences, haven't they?
Yes,
You've come upon some.
Yeah, I was seeing a lot of different commentaries point out how it's a different Greek word for basket used here, and that this one was often more used with Gentiles versus it's a different word used in this last story from chapter 14. So it is often thought that this is a story of feeding Gentiles, that the disciples might partly, we wonder why the disciples don't remember what Jesus just did, the last chapter. And there's a theory that it might not be that they forgot what Jesus did. It might be that they're thinking, these are Gentiles. We don't need to feed them. We don't care as much about them. That might not be true. That's a theory, but there are a lot of theories about how this might be a passage written about Jesus showing the same abundant love and care for Gentiles who have been following him for 3 days. They've left their towns, and that Jesus still wants to care for them. Is there anything else you notice in this story?
No, I think you've really hit the great teaching to take away from this. Of all the similarities, I think it explains to me why Matthew would put in a story that seems so redundant and repetitive. It's because it really isn't the same story. It has the added insight that Jesus was just as eager to meet the hunger needs of a Gentile audience as he was of a Jewish audience. And I think we've seen that all the way through, including the Syrophoenician woman. And you're right. The big takeaway is that at every point we see Jesus full of compassion, but always putting that compassion into gear in acts of service and generosity. And now we are just reminded that he did that for everyone.
Yeah, that for every person who's there. And that's just so great to see that there's men, women, and children, all of them got to eat. And there was such a need. He talks about how he's afraid that they would faint on the way. So how beautiful that is. I think you pointed out as well, we were chatting earlier about the different number of leftovers. So it's 12 baskets before. So tell us about that.
I don't want to read too much into the numbers, but 12 is definitely a number that we connect with the Israelites, with the Jewish people, right? The 12 tribes of Israel. And so there were 12 baskets left over in the feeding of the 5,000. Here there are 7. And the number 7 was considered a perfect number by Gentiles. They're similar because 3 and 4. For ancient people, 3 was the number of divinity, of the gods.
Okay.
4 was the number of the natural world, like the 4 corners of the universe, the 4 points of the compass.
Okay.
It's the world.
Interesting.
So if you've got God in the world, you've got everything. If you've got the Creator and creation, you've got it all. So Jews multiplied 3 times 4 and got 12. That's the full number, the perfect, complete number. Other people tended to add them. Then they got 7.
So that's how they got 7. Okay.
So in each case, God is a God of fullness.
I love that. A God of fullness, of abundance, of grace, compassion, and generosity. We've gotten to look at so many good stories today. Are there any themes or takeaways as we put them all together? Do you see any patterns that we should be learning from today?
Well, we learned that legalism can get in the way of true righteousness. And that judgmentalism does get in the way of mercy. That's what we learned from the first story. From the second, we learned that no matter how far somebody appears to be from God, away from God, Canaanite woman, Gentile, they worship pagan gods, if she catches a glimpse of Jesus, she sees in him something worth having. And the disciples don't kind of see that right away. They want to send her away. But Jesus tests her faith, finds it maybe young and just beginning, but firm, and responds to her need in compassion. And here at the end, we just get that reminder again that Jesus is for everyone.
That's so great. Yeah, those are some beautiful lessons we hear. We learn so many things about who Jesus is, the character of Jesus through this chapter. I think that's what we have for us today in Matthew 15. We'll be back next week as we explore Matthew 16 together.